a 10-page form, 11 rows of film. On November 20th, 1952, a CIA clerk in the agency's Records Disposition branch finished typing a presentation form for graphic material, catalogue number CIA RDP 83 004 23 or 04 2ver, declassified in 1999 and now public in the CIA Reading Room, listing the contents of 11 rolls of 35mm negatives shot across Egypt, Lebanon and Afghanistan by an unidentified American traveller in 1950 whose name, affiliation and purpose were all redacted. The clerk typed steadily down each page, mostly mundane entries, Cairo streets, tourists at the pyramids. Then on page 3, for roll number 4, they did something they did with only a handful of frames in the whole catalogue. They flagged a single line with a semicolon and a date, so a future reader could not miss it. The line is 6 words long. Temple under Sphinx, July 50. In the 73 years since, they have never been scanned, never been published, and, by any researcher's record, never been looked at. Tonight we follow 3 things: the document, the unnamed photographer, and the question of what sits beneath the Sphinx. Settle in. The CIA RDP 83 004 23 R0001 20017 file, in its actual physical form, is unremarkable. It is a 10-page government form, typed on a standard manual typewriter of the period, on a paper stock the National Archives conservators have identified as Standard Administrative Bond, 1952 issue. The pages have been bound, in the original, by a single brass paperclip. The paperclip has rusted. The rust has stained the upper left corners of all 10 pages. The conservators have left the rust in place, on the principle that the rust is part of the document now. The form was filled out by a CIA clerk whose handwriting and typewriter idiosyncrasies have been identified by an archives historian as belonging to a single individual who served in the agency's Records Disposition branch from 1949 to 1956, and prepare them for permanent transfer to the National Archives. The form we are following tonight is one of them. The form's content in 1952 was not considered sensitive. The contents had been classified at intake as confidential. This is the lowest of the 3 substantive classification levels the CIA used at the period: top secret, secret, confidential, with for official use only as a 4th subclassification tier. Confidential was the routine classification for material the agency wanted to keep out of public view, but did not consider critically sensitive. Tourist photographs taken by an unidentified American in friendly countries in 1950 would, by the standards of the period, ordinarily not have been classified at all. The decision to classify them as confidential implies that something about the source or the circumstance of collection was sensitive, but not, by 1952 standards, urgently so. The form was approved for release to the National Archives Public Reading Room in 1999. The redactions on it, the name of the traveller, the name of the traveller's organisational affiliation, the reason for travel, were retained at release. The CIA's standard explanation for redactions of this kind is to protect sources and methods. The redactions in 1999 were probably routine. The original sources were almost certainly dead by then. The redactions remain. We do not know who the photographer was. We can infer some things. The photographer was American. The CIA's presentation form for graphic material was used only for materials received from US citizens or from US-affiliated institutions. Non-US materials went through a different intake process. The redaction of the traveller's name in the form's header indicates that the photographer was, at minimum, identifiable to the agency at the time of intake. They were not anonymous walk-ins. The photographer travelled extensively. The 11 rolls cover in geographic sequence Gibraltar, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, briefly, Egypt, the western Saudi Arabian coastline, and Afghanistan. This is an itinerary consistent with someone making a single trip of approximately 5 to 6 months, by air for the long legs, and by car and train for the regional segments. The total cost of such a trip, in 1950 American dollars, would have been roughly $7,000 to $9,000, equivalent to $75,000 to $95,000, $22,600. The photographer either had substantial private means or was on an official allowance. The photographer's photographic equipment was a 35mm camera. The archive's conservators, who have examined sample frames from contemporaneous CIA archive negatives of similar format, have identified the camera as most likely a Leica 3, or a Contax-de-Eye, both German-manufactured high-end rangefinders of the period, expensive and unusual for casual tourists. Embassy staff, military attachés and OSS-trained operators were the most common American users of these camera models in 1950. The photographer's organizational affiliation was redacted. 15-character agency names in 1950 included State Department, 16 characters with the space, Embassy Cairo, 13, Embassy Beirut. The most plausible 15-character entries are Uses Information, 16 with space, the United States Information Service abbreviation, or Cult Affairs BEG, the Cultural Affairs section of the Baghdad Embassy. Neither of these are conventionally redacted as a matter of routine. The redaction is, in other words, unusual. The photographer's stated purpose for the trip was redacted. The longer redaction is consistent with a full-sentence description of the purpose, something more elaborate than a routine cultural visit or tourism description. The photographer was American. They had means, they had unusual equipment, they had a redacted affiliation and a redacted purpose. The catalogue itself, when you read it in sequence, has a rhythm. Each roll is listed by number. Each frame within each roll is listed by sequence. Each frame is described in 3 to 7 words. The descriptions are not narrative. They are not literary. They are the bureaucratic museum register of a clerk transcribing what they see when they hold a strip of negative film up to a light box. Row 4, taken in Egypt in July of 1950, lists 36 exposures across 36 numbered entries. Tourists at Egyptian Museum. Outside hotel. Then comes the entry on line 13 of roll 4, Temple under Sphinx, July 50. The semicolon and the date are unusual. Most of the catalogue's entries do not carry a date. The roll is already dated, so individual frames inherit the roll's date. The semicolon and date pattern appears on the catalogue exactly 47 times against more than 400 total entries. The pattern is associated, the archive's historians have noted, with frames the clerk found anomalous enough to call out specifically. The clerk used the semicolon date format when the contents of the photograph appeared to merit special attention. When, for whatever reason, the clerk wanted the date to be impossible to miss when someone later read the catalogue. The next 4 lines on, row 4 return to the generic. Sphinx North View. Ruins near Sphinx. Ruins near Sphinx. Detail. The clerk thought, when they wrote the catalogue, that temple under Sphinx was a different thing from Sphinx, from ruins near Sphinx, and from any of the pyramid's entries. They moved on. The same pattern occurs on roll 8, taken in Lebanon in October of 1950. The roll has 42 exposures. The first 36 are Beirut and the Lebanese coast. Frames 37 and 38 are Baalbek, General View, and Baalbek, Columns. Frame 39 is Stone of the Pregnant Woman, Quarry. Both say, in the same words, Spinning Mechanism at Baalbek. The clerk catalogued two separate photographs of spinning mechanism, as distinct from the general views of Baalbek's temples and the famous stone in the quarry. Two photographs, same subject. The clerk thought the spinning mechanism was worth its own pair of inventory entries. The simplest explanation for the Sphinx line comes next, and it is the one most of the news coverage has settled on. The mainstream archaeological reading of the Temple under Sphinx entry is the most likely one. It is also the one the modern news coverage of the document has largely settled on. There is, at the foot of the Great Sphinx, a stone structure that, in 1950, and indeed for most of the preceding 3,000 years, sat partially below the level of the surrounding desert. The structure is now known as the Sphinx Temple. It is an Old Kingdom Egyptian temple dating to roughly 2500 BCE, built of massive limestone blocks. It sits directly east of the Sphinx, at a lower elevation than the Sphinx itself, and is, by any literal reading of geography, under the Sphinx, in the sense that the Sphinx looks down on it from the higher plateau. The Sphinx temple was buried in sand from at least the New Kingdom period onward. By 1900, only the tops of its largest blocks were visible above the desert floor. The systematic excavation of the temple began in 1925, under the direction of the French Egyptologist Émile Barrès. Barrès was an unusual figure in 1920s Egyptology. He was not a trained archaeologist in the modern sense. He had begun his Egyptian career as a railway engineer for the colonial administration. He had drifted into archaeology in his 40s, through a combination of personal interest and the political opportunities the French government afforded him during the British Protectorate. He worked at Giza for 11 years. He cleared the Sphinx itself, the Sphinx temple, and the surrounding plateau. By 1936, when Barrès's work ended, the Sphinx temple was fully exposed. It had been mapped, it had been photographed, it had been described in the limited French-language reports Barrès sent to the Colonial Antiquities Service. By 1950, when our anonymous American photographer arrived at Giza, the Sphinx temple was a routine stop on the visitor itinerary. It was perfectly possible, the orthodox reading goes, for a 1950 tourist to take a photograph of the Sphinx temple, write "Temple under Sphinx" on a 35mm negative envelope, and forget about it. This is the boring explanation. It accounts for the words "Temple under Sphinx." It accounts for the date. It accounts for the location. It is, the orthodox reading concludes, probably what happened. What the orthodox reading does not fully account for is the cataloguing pattern. The clerk who processed the 11 rolls in 1952 did not say Sphinx Temple. The clerk said Temple under Sphinx. Those are not the same words. The clerk's catalogue uses Sphinx Temple nowhere else. The clerk uses Temple under Sphinx exactly once. So why does the boring explanation not quite settle the matter? 3 details about the catalogue make the simplest orthodox reading harder. The first detail is the separate enumeration. There is Sphinx, West View. There is Sphinx, North View. There is also ruins near Sphinx and ruins near Sphinx detail. By the time the clerk reached line 13 and wrote Temple under Sphinx, July 50, they had already categorized every other Sphinx-related image into one of 2 buckets: direct views of the monument or generic ruins around the monument. They did not write Sphinx Temple West View, they wrote Temple under Sphinx. The second detail is the semicolon date pattern. As we noted, this pattern occurs 47 times across the catalogue's 11 rolls, against more than 400 entries total. The pattern is associated, in the clerk's habits, with frames that merited being flagged. Some of the other 47 instances are mundane. They tend to mark frames the clerk thought might be relevant to a specific intelligence question the agency was tracking at the time. But the pattern in itself is a flag. It means the clerk wanted future readers of the catalogue to be able to find this specific frame easily. The third detail is the geometry. The Sphinx temple, the one Barres excavated, sits at the foot of the Sphinx, in front of the Sphinx, east of the Sphinx, east of the Sphinx. It is not, by any natural reading of English, under the Sphinx. A 1950 American tourist looking at the Sphinx temple from the standard tourist vantage point would have described it as the temple in front of the Sphinx, or the temple below the Sphinx. They would not naturally have written temple under Sphinx. The phrase temple under Sphinx reads, to a contemporary ear, as a temple that is physically beneath the Sphinx, not in front of it, not at the foot of it, but underground. This is, of course, what the modern viral cycle has fastened onto, and the orthodox reading has not fully accounted for it. The defenders of the orthodox reading have argued that under might have been used loosely, or that the clerk might have transcribed under when the photographer wrote near. They are also, by the standards of the document itself, not what the page says. To understand why the public seized on this so quickly, we have to go back to a clairvoyant who described a chamber beneath the Sphinx almost 100 years ago. The reason the public response to the document has exploded, the reason the entries on ancient origins, Zero Hedge, modernity, Coast to Coast AM, and a dozen other sites have run the same story across May 11th and 12th, 2026, is that the document arrives into a public imagination that has been prepared for it for almost 100 years. The preparation began in 1932. In that year, an American clairvoyant named Edgar Cayce, who had built, through the previous 2 decades, a substantial following based on what he called trance readings, gave a session in which he described a hidden underground structure beneath the Sphinx. The structure, in Cayce's session, was a hall of records. It contained, the session said, the history of Atlantis and the ancient world, preserved by an antediluvian civilization that knew of its own impending destruction. The hall, Cayce said, was located between the paws of the Sphinx, in a chamber whose entrance has been sealed but is not lost. It would be reopened, Cayce said, in the days when the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid begin to reveal their secrets to the world. The Cayce predictions are, in 1932 and 1934, the first appearance of the Hall of Records under the Sphinx in any modern source. Case's followers founded the Association for Research and Enlightenment, the AR, in 1931, and the AR archived Case's session transcripts as canonical religious prophetic literature. The Case predictions remain in 2026 the foundational text for every modern Hall of Records claim. By 1950, when our anonymous photographer was at Giza, the Case predictions had been published, translated, and were circulating in American esoteric circles. The CIA clerk in 1952 may or may not have known about Case. The agency had institutional awareness of esoteric currents in American culture, but did not, in 1952, prioritize them. What is harder to establish is whether the photographer deliberately captioned their frame temple under Sphinx because of case-adjacent expectations, or whether they wrote the words descriptively about something they had actually seen. Case's predicted reopening in 1998 did not happen. No Hall of Records was found. The Egyptian Antiquities authorities have, since the 1990s, repeatedly stated that no such chamber exists. The AR, to its credit, has not abandoned the prediction. It has simply moved the date forward. What turned Case's quiet prophecy into a mass audience claim came in the early 1990s, and it began with a geologist. The Hall of Records claim received its biggest public boost in the early 1990s through a sequence of events that have been carefully documented in Egyptological journals and in less carefully documented popular books. In 1991, the geologist Robert Schoch of Boston University, whose work we covered in our earlier video on the Sphinx, published the water erosion hypothesis. Schoch argued on geological grounds that the erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure walls were consistent with prolonged rainfall exposure and inconsistent with the Old Kingdom dating mainstream Egyptology had assigned to the monument. Schoch proposed that the Sphinx was much older, possibly 9000 BCE or earlier, and that the Old Kingdom Egyptians had merely repaired and refaced a monument they had inherited from a pre-existing civilization. The Schoch hypothesis was peer-reviewed. It was respectful. It was, in academic terms, the highest credibility ancient mystery claim of the decade. It opened the door for less careful claims that followed. In 1993, the producer Boris Said and the documentary filmmaker John Anthony West released The Mystery of the Sphinx, a feature-length NBC television documentary narrated by Charlton Heston. The documentary used Schoch's geological argument as its credibility anchor and built outward from there. It introduced to a mass audience the claim that there were chambers under the Sphinx that the Egyptian authorities were preventing access to. In 1995, the journalist Joseph Shaw, funded by the ARE, commissioned the geophysicist Thomas Debicki to conduct a ground-penetrating radar survey of the Sphinx enclosure. Debicki's survey identified in published findings 3 subsurface anomalies in the immediate area of the Sphinx. One of them, the survey said, was consistent with a rectangular chamber approximately 9 meters by 12 meters, located 5 meters beneath the surface, between the Sphinx's pores. The Egyptian Antiquities Service permitted no further investigation. In 1996, Robert Bovall and Graham Hancock published The Message of the Sphinx. The book argued that the chambers Debicki had identified were the Hall of Records Case predicted, that the Egyptian authorities were aware of them, and that the access was being suppressed for political reasons. The book sold over 1 million copies in its first year. In 1999, the year Case had predicted the Hall of Records would be opened, The Egyptian Antiquities Service issued a final formal statement that no chambers had been found, that no chambers existed, and that the topic was closed to further claims. Our 1952 CIA document was declassified, by coincidence or otherwise, the same year, 1999. In 2015, an international scientific consortium called Scan Pyramids began a multi-year project to use cosmic ray muography to map the interior structure of the major Giza pyramids. Muography is a technique that uses subatomic particles called muons, produced by cosmic rays interacting with the upper atmosphere to image dense structures from outside. Muons, which pass through ordinary matter at known rates, are absorbed at different rates by different densities. By placing muon detectors outside a pyramid, you can build a density map of the interior without ever drilling into it. The Scan Pyramids project published its first major result in November 2017 in the journal Nature. The result was the identification of a previously unknown void inside the Great Pyramid of Khufu, a large, roughly 30-metre-long cavity located above the Grand Gallery, with internal dimensions comparable to the Grand Gallery itself. The void had been completely unsuspected by Egyptologists. It had been sealed since the pyramid's construction. It contained, as far as muography could tell, no objects, just empty space. The 2017 Khufu void result is, by every measure, the most important Egyptological discovery of the 21st century. It established two things at once. The first is that ancient Egyptian engineers were capable of constructing hidden chambers that survived undetected for 4,500 years. The second, and the one that bears on our 1952 document, is that modern technology is capable of finding such chambers without invasive excavation. The Khufu void was found from outside the pyramid, using particle physics, without disturbing a single stone. This is, in the strict sense, what would be required to settle the Hall of Records question. A muography survey of the Sphinx enclosure, modelled on the Scan Pyramids approach, could establish whether there is in fact a chamber beneath the Sphinx. The technology exists. The cost is approximately $3 million over a 2-year survey period. The consortium has, since 2018, included the Sphinx in its proposed future work list. The Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities has not, as of 2026, granted permission for the survey. The reason given in the most recent public statement is preservation concerns, the worry that mounting external detectors near the monument might cause incidental damage. The reason most Egyptologists believe privately is political, that a survey, regardless of what it finds, would create either a press cycle or a tourist management problem that the Antiquities Service does not want to deal with. What the modern science of muography says in 2026 is that we could know. We have not yet been allowed to look. And so, on the question of what the unnamed 1950 photographer actually saw when they captioned a single 35mm negative temple under Sphinx, July 50, we're left with the same uncomfortable position we have been in for the rest of this slate. The orthodox answer is the boring one. The CIA clerk in 1952 transcribed the caption as written. The negative was filed. The phrase, "Temple under Sphinx," is simply imprecise English for a routine tourist photograph of a known, above-ground monument. That answer is defensible. It is, in 2026, what the academic mainstream and most science journalists have settled on. What that answer does not address is the Baalbek entries on the same row. Spinning mechanism at Baalbek. 2 photographs, catalogued separately from the general Baalbek temple views. The skeptical archaeology commentator Jason Colavito has suggested that the spinning mechanism was probably a textile spinning wheel. Baalbek's region was historically famous for wool processing. That explanation is plausible. It is also, the careful reader has to admit, strange. Tourists do not normally photograph wool wheels and then catalogue them with the same procedural care they used for the famous Trilithon megaliths in the same archaeological complex. The CIA clerk thought spinning mechanism at Baalbek warranted 2 separate inventory entries. There is, in the end, the unresolved object at the centre of all this. They have, by the archive's own catalogue, been in continuous physical custody since then. They have not, by any researcher's record, been looked at by anyone in 73 years. If someone, anyone, were to go to the National Archives, file a research request for the negatives associated with CIA RDP 83 0423 R004423 R00100000 and SASC, and asked to view the actual rolls of film referenced in the catalogue, they would, by the archive's own access policies, be granted access. The negatives are not classified, they are not restricted, they are simply unphotographed in the digital age. We do not have to decide tonight what is on them. The document we have been following is real. The catalogue page is on the CIA Reading Room website. The negatives are at the National Archives. The Sphinx is in the desert. Next week we return to a Sumerian story. Wherever you are in the world, thank you for letting us tell you a story. Comment your country and your time below.